Reverberations of a History Unfinished, an original poem by Jeffrey C. White. Listen, the past is not the past. It lingers, a specter in the marrow of monuments, branding its weight into the architecture of every institution that swore itself reformed but never truly dismantled the foundation. They call it history, as if it were a sealed vault, as if it did not haunt the breath between syllables in courtrooms, as if it did not whisper through the steel bars of privatized cells, as if the chains were ever truly unshackled or the gavel ever truly blind. But history does not rest. It ricochets off the pavement where bodies have fallen, lodges itself into the lungs of those still gasping for air, wields itself in the hands of power like a scalpel disguised as justice, slicing through rights with the same precision that once justified ownership of skin. And we are the consequence of every broken treaty, every red line drawn in blood, every ballot burned before it could be cast, every debt unpaid to those who built the very streets that refuse to bear their names. They call it history. But what is history if not a promise unfulfilled? If not the drum of footsteps marching forward through the echoes of the past still rattle the bones of the present? No, history is not past. It is stitched into the fabric of laws that still choke. It is pressed into the hands of children born beneath the weight of a system that was never meant to hold them upright. And so we speak, not to remember, but to reckon, not to mourn, but to ignite, not to wait for justice, but to demand it, until the echoes no longer speak for us, until we write the future with hands unbound. What's up, what's up, what's up? Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. It's your boy, it's your cousin, it's your best friend, Jeff here. Welcome back to the Visionaries Vault, a Black intellectual podcast. Thank you all for tuning into episode 2. I just want to take a moment to say how grateful we are for the overwhelming love and support for episode 1 and for the launch of this podcast. The conversations, the messages, the reflections, y'all showed up, and we appreciate every single one of you for engaging with this space in such a real way. One of the things that stood out to me the most was how many of you resonated with the idea of inheriting a system that we didn't create. That reality of being born into structures that were designed long before we ever had to say in them, and that's exactly where we want to pick up today. Before we even get into the conversation about DEI and what identity politics looks like in this current moment, we have to talk about identity itself, how it's shaped, how it's perceived, and how, for many of us, it's something we spend our lives reclaiming. And for me, that starts with where I come from, Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. Before we get started, I want to establish this understanding of what identity is, so we're having this conversation on the same page. Identity for me isn't just about who we are, it's about how the world sees us, how it chooses to categorize us, and in many cases, how it tries to erase or redefine us. It's something you spend your whole life reclaiming from those narratives. So before we get into the larger conversation about identity politics in the age of DEI, I want to start with my own foundations, who I am, where I come from, and the experiences that shaped me. I moved through this world as a Black man, as someone raised in a working class home, as an educator, as an activist, as a scholar, and none of these exist in isolation. That's the thing about identity. It's layered. It shifts depending on who's in the room and who holds the power in that space. Sometimes people only see me as one of those things at a time. Sometimes they refuse to acknowledge certain aspects of my identity altogether, but my experiences, the ones that built me, the ones that shape the way I see this world, are all inseparable from each other. When we talk about identity politics, we're talking about the ways in which our lived experiences, so our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality, are not just personal, but political. Because in this country, the United States that is, identity determines access. It determines opportunity. It determines who is protected, who is heard, and who is pushed to the margins. You know, I want to take a minute to clarify something from the first episode. So some of you folk misunderstood my description of Bed-Stuy. So let me be clear. I grew up in Bed-Stuy in the 90s, before gentrification ran rampant and transformed the neighborhood into what we know today. The Bed-Stuy I knew was vibrant. It was full of culture, full of life. But it was also a place where survival was the first thing you learned, where helicopters overhead wasn't unusual, where police sirens and gang violence weren't just background noise, they were part of a daily life. That wasn't because of my community was inherently violent. It was because the city, this country, made the choice to condemn Blackness. Like many Black and brown communities in New York, was shaped by redlining, a practice that goes back to the 1930s when banks and federal government systemically denied mortgages to Black families, ensuring that we could not build generational wealth the same way that white families could. The practice may not have been called redlining in the 90s, but its impact was still alive, like predatory lending and landlords deliberately neglecting buildings to drive tenants out, also in schools that were underfunded compared to those just a few subway stops away from each other. It showed up in ways that the NYPD policed our neighborhoods. So the 90s weren't just about general crime in Brooklyn, they were about over-policing and criminalizing Black youth. Policies like stop and frisk, what technically became policies, and I think like the early 2000s, what were already common practice in the 90s, meant that kids like me, Black boys just walking down the street, were seen as threats before we were seen as children. It showed up in how the war on drugs wasn't a war on addiction, but a war on Black and brown people filling prisons instead of providing resources for healing. All of this, the underfunding of schools, the over-policing, the housing discrimination, wasn't just a reality of my neighborhood. It was part of a system, or is still part of a system we have inherited. Just like I said in episode 1, we didn't create these conditions. We were born into them. And in many ways, these conditions tried to define us before we even had a chance to define ourselves. And then came gentrification. Now, I want to define this clearly because gentrification has become a catch-all term. But it's at its core, gentrification isn't just about new coffee shops or high-rise buildings. It's about displacement. Let's name it. It's about the intentional process where a city neglects a community for decades, labels it as undesirable, and then once outside investors see an economic potential, suddenly rebrands it as the next hotspot neighborhood. So when I was growing up, Bed-Stuy was considered dangerous by the same people who now line up for overpriced brownstones. When we lived there, my family that is, landlords let buildings rot. But once white and wealthy residents started moving in, suddenly there was money for renovations, for Whole Foods, for extra police patrol. But now not to criminalize, to protect. This shift doesn't just change a neighborhood. It changes who feels like they belong there. When I go back to Bed-Stuy now, I see new people jogging past stoops where old men used to sit and talk. I see a bunch of spots where corner stores used to be, and I see landlords forcing out tenants who have been there for generations, tripling the rent because they know someone will pay it. That's not the neighborhood improvement that they told me it was going to be. That's erasure. And the people who built that community, the people who kept it alive, despite the city's neglect, are now being pushed out because suddenly their existence is bad for property values. So you're like, Jeff, how does this tie back to identity? It's simple. Your environment shapes you. When you grow up in a community that's underfunded, that's over-policed and constantly labeled as dangerous, it impacts how you see yourself. It impacts how the world sees you too. It teaches you that where you come from is less than, your culture is criminal until it's repackaged and sold back to the same people who once rejected it. That does something to you. It creates a tension between who you are and who the world expects you to be. And for me, that tension meant navigating silence and survival. It meant learning early on that keeping my head down felt safer than speaking out. It meant wrestling with the reality that no matter how hard I worked, that the world had already decided that what they thought about me. But it also meant learning resilience. It meant seeing the power of community, of Black joy, of the way we make something out of nothing time and time again. This just isn't about me. It's very possible that anyone growing up in these conditions carries that same weight. If you're told from a childhood that your existence is a problem, it shapes how you move through the world. And that's what's at the core of identity politics. Not just recognizing our experiences, but understanding that they are shaped by the systems that long predate us. So as we get deeper into this conversation, I want to hold space for those complexities. Because identity politics, before it became a buzzword, was about fighting for our right to exist fully, to be seen fully. And before we even bring DEI into this conversation, we have to reckon with that history. We have to understand what it means to inherit a system built against us and what it means to fight for something better.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's your co-host, it's your boy, Mutangilai Christian Vaza. I'm honored to share this platform with my brother Jeffrey. Every time we have a conversation, it hits a different part of my soul and I just feel empowered. And that's why we wanted to have these conversations openly. See, we wanted to empower others to challenge the conditions in which they're born. That's how we reclaim our identity and discover who we are. When it comes to my identity, it's more than just where I am or where I grew up. It's the places that my family has been, the people who have fought and resisted there and have built a philosophy of life. I often think of Patrice Lumumba, who defiantly rejected and resisted colonialism. When African men were seen as nothing but beasts of a burden and yoked to the will of the oppressors, their humanities was disregarded, identities erased, as they became the fuel that built empires. The world watching, he was able to redefine what it meant to be African. We shall show the world what the black man can do working in liberty, making Congo the pride of Africa, said Lumumba. That is why I have the 30th of June, 1960, engraved in my heart. Being born in South Africa, I had no epiphany, no singular revelation, no moment of truth, but steady accumulation of 1,000 thoughts and moments that has produced in me a quiet anger, a rebellious desire to fight this system that has imprisoned my people over generations and centuries in different places, spaces, and time. Ultimately, I can't help but feel a sense of pride when I think about where my family comes from and the people that come from that same location. And today, I feel a sense of responsibility to fight against the injustices that persists in the place where I am today, which is Regina, Saskatchewan, where 50% of black men struggle to get a higher level education and are overrepresented in prison systems. That is to say, there are more black and brown bodies in prisons and jails today than there are leading classrooms and businesses.
When we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's easy to think about the modern frameworks, something that corporations and universities started pushing in recent years, but DEI didn't come out of nowhere. It has its deep roots in this country's long struggle for civil rights, labor rights, and equal opportunity. And like everything in American history, it didn't emerge without resistance. The fight for equity, whether in education, employment, or government, has always been met with pushback. And that pushback is just as much as part of this history as the progress itself. So before we get into this history of DEI, let's break it down and actually see what it means in simple terms. So DEI stands for, once again, diversity, equity, inclusion. And it basically is about making sure everyone, no matter their race, gender, sexuality, ability, or background, has a fair shot at opportunities and feels welcome in different spaces, whether it's at work, in school, or in community. So the D stands for diversity. It's all about having different kinds of people in a space. So multiracial groups, diversity in gender, age, experience, and so on. The E stands for equity, and that's all about making sure that everyone has what they need to succeed in that given space, even if that means giving extra help to those who have been held back in the past. And then the I stands for inclusion, and that's making sure that everyone feels like they belong in that space and their voices matter. So when it comes to benefiting from these policies, in this past year, it turns out that white women have actually gained the most from DEI efforts, especially in jobs and education. But also, it helped Black and Latinx folk, LGBTQ people, and those with disabilities get more opportunities and fairer shot at success. And fun fact, businesses and schools that really commit to DEI tend to do better overall. They're more creative, make better decisions, and even make more money. Who would have thought? But before we get into DEI and before it was this corporate initiative, before it was a training program, it was a battle fought on the streets, in courtrooms, in legislative halls. This political lineage of DEI starts with a broader fight for civil rights and racial equity in America. A fight that is as old as the country itself. And in many ways, we can trace the foundational principles of DEI back to Reconstruction. And so between around 1867 and 1877, the first time in U.S. history where laws were created to attempt some form of racial inclusion. So the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, abolished slavery and granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people and gave Black men the right to vote. But what happened almost immediately? A backlash. White supremacist violates and policies like Black codes and Jim Crow laws effectively dismantled those gains and created the first major wave of what I call a white lash, which is a recautionary movement designed to restore white dominance in economics or in economic and political spaces. So we transition and fast forward to the mid 20th century. So 1940s, the 1950s, and we see a legal groundwork for what becomes DEI. One of the earliest examples, Executive Order 8802, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1941. So this order banned discriminatory hiring practices in defense industries and government jobs. It wasn't an act of moral conviction, it was a wartime necessity. The U.S. needed Black workers in the war economy, and activists like Abe Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, pressured FDR by threatening a massive civil rights march on Washington. So we transition and go down a little bit and fast forward to 1954, and we look at Brown versus Board, the landmark Supreme Court case that struck segregation in public schools. That just wasn't about education. It was about the direct attack on legal infrastructures of white supremacy. And what followed? Massive white resistance. The Southern Manifesto, a doctrine signed by over 100 Southern congressmen that vowed to resist school desegregation, leading to a decade-long war over integration. And then we have the civil rights movement of 1950s and 60s. And it wasn't just about voting rights and bus boycotts. It was about access to jobs, schools, and political representation. The very thing that DEI initiatives aim to address today. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 became the legal foundation for the diversity policies by outlawing discrimination in public spaces and employment. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, was established to enforce these laws, ensuring workplaces couldn't openly refuse to hire Black workers anymore. But even with that legal victory, racism didn't disappear. It adapted. Many businesses and schools found ways to work around these laws through coded language and new forms of discrimination that we call racially neutral laws, which simply means that we're not going to explicitly state that race is a defining factor on how we're going to discriminate, but rather uses language and rhetoric to kind of circumvent that and create loopholes like we see within the 13th Amendment when it comes to the abolishment of slavery, right? We're not going to say that we're going to enslave Black folk anymore, but we're going to attack Black and brown people and put them into prisons, which was prominent during the war on drugs era. So if we're talking about the direct ancestor of DEI policies, we have to talk about affirmative action. It just wasn't a phrase. It was an intentional policy designed to correct centuries of racial and gender exclusion. The term was first used in Executive Order 10925, signed by JFK in 1961, I believe, requiring government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure employment free of racial bias. And then Lyndon B. Johnson expanded with Executive Order 11246, which required federal contractors to actively recruit and hire people of color and women. And of course, what do you think followed? A white lash. So by the 1970s, affirmative action became a political flashpoint. White politicians and business leaders started using the phrase reverse discrimination to undermine policies designed to level the playing field. Doesn't that sound familiar? The same language being used to dismantle DEI today was being used back then to dismantle affirmative action. A sad pattern and echo of progress followed by immediate resistance. So what does that all tell us? DEI, whatever form it has taken throughout history, has always been about the fight for access to education, to jobs, to full participation in society. Every time there has been progress, there has been white lash. Every time the door has been opened just a little bit wider, there has been an effort to slam it shut.
Canada has always claimed to be a diverse land and a beacon of quality. I've heard too many prime ministers talk about the Commonwealth only existing because of the multiracial association on the basis of race. I've heard Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, say there is no history of systemic discrimination in Canada. Even Paul Martin said, I didn't realize there was slavery anywhere in Canada. And this is the lived history that I've had to experience. But I look back into the reality of the history books, and something happened in 1954 in Ontario, Canada, that started in a small segregated town called Buxton. It resulted in the Fair Employment Act, which was important to Canada because it was the first piece of legislation aimed at banning discrimination in the workplace based on race, religion, nationality, and ethnic origin. This was enacted in Ontario, and it marked a significant step in ensuring equal opportunities for marginalized communities. But it all started with a man named Hugh Burnett, Canada's Martin Luther King. He was a Black Canadian civil rights activist and a key figure in the fight against racial segregation and discrimination. So, how did it start? Unlike the United States, where segregation was enforced by law, Canada has its own version. It was called the Freedom of Association Act and the Freedom of Commerce Act. These two acts allowed businesses to hire and serve anyone that they chose, and it was deeply embedded in social norms and systemic discrimination. And this was evident in policies that allowed restaurants, barbershops, and other businesses to deny Black customers. In Dresden, a small town in southwestern Ontario, segregation was normal, and Hugh Burnett regularly faced discrimination. He was a successful carpenter, and he served during World War II. He enlisted in the Canadian Army, served overseas. Despite this, him and other Black veterans still were treated as second-class citizens and denied jobs and access to businesses. In the fall of 1948, frustrated and confused, by the continual treatment of Black service members, he met at the home of Bernard and Percy Carter, along with 30 others, and together they formed a group called the National Unity Association, the NUA. In 1949, they finally formed their purpose, and their purpose is to promote interest in better group relations, equality, fellowship, goodwill, and understanding among all people, regardless of race or religion. Included in their constitution was that they looked forward to a world that would judge people by their character rather than by their national origin, color of skin, or religion. That's right, folks. That's in 1949. When they finally approached council members, they were rejected. Not only that, they were rejected 6 more times. City council members responded with, "Restaurants are not owned by the state. If they were, we would have control. But how can you force any man to serve anyone he does not want to serve?" At the time the NUA was gaining major momentum, this had been the first major loss in their campaign. But they weren't dejected, and by 1954, they found a new purpose. Burnett and 2 members of the NUA traveled to Ottawa in May to make their case to the federal government, Premier Frost at the time. When Burnett arrives to Ottawa, he isn't just received by Premier Frost, he's received by Frost and the entire cabinet. Frost is so impressed with Burnett and his presentation that he signs a bill and puts it into effect, and it's called the Fair Accommodations Practice. This takes effect in June of 1954. The accommodations practices ensures that businesses are not only serving all members of society, but also hiring as well. Now, although the bill has been passed, you can rest assured that most businesses were not following the practice. So the NUA start to canvass different areas like Dresden, restaurants and barbershops to try to ensure that this accommodations practice is being implemented. They would enter businesses that they knew were discriminatory and ask for service, and they would remain there until they were refused. And when they were refused, they would stay. In other words, they began sit-ins. They also developed a new strategy. They would enter discriminatory businesses, ask for service, and when they were refused, they would record the information and file an official complaint with the Department of Labor, who was responsible for enforcing the FAP. For Burnett, this put his family in danger. They were often sent threats over their lives and anonymous letters. In fact, one night, Burnett's home is bombed, and Burnett and his family obtain a gun for self-defense. This, of course, alarms the entire nation that it generates headlines across the country. And there are serious attempts to discredit Burnett, claiming that he was a communist agitator. Burnett, of course, denied the charges, emphatically saying, "You don't have to be a communist to demand your rights." And through all of this, he continued to pressure the government and businesses to ensure that the new laws were properly enforced, often challenging local businesses that ignored the anti-discrimination laws. This is just one of the many DEI acts that continue to positively change the cultural landscape of a nation. Removing the diverse lenses we use to build our nation, our society, is one way to ensure that stories, people, moments are erased from our history books.
So let's shift gears and talk about where we are now, how the historical battle over identity politics and DEI is playing out in real time. So as we know, DEI in America is under attack, not in theory, not in abstract policy debates, but in real material ways that are already reshaping workplaces, politics, and economy. Corporations are cutting DEI programs, universities are backtracking on diversity commitments, and politicians are making it clear that so-called equity initiatives were never meant to last. They were temporary concessions to a moment of reckoning and what I believe was a PR strategy to calm the storm after George Floyd. And now, with the political landscape shifting, those in power feel emboldened to do what they've always wanted to do. Hey, let's name what it is. No Black people. So in 2020, there were attacks on Black Lives Matter. In 2022, we had attacks on critical race theory, CRT. 2024, attacks on this woke agenda that they've coined. And now in 2025, there are attacks on DEI. That's what this DEI divestment really means. Black. They mean Black. No Black people, no people of color. It's not just about budgets or returning to this mediocrity of focusing on skills over identity. It's about making sure that workplaces, boardrooms, and institutions remain as white as possible, as male as possible, as unchallenged as possible. It's about keeping Black people and people of color and anyone else who disrupts the natural order of white supremacy in the margins. And this isn't new. Every moment of perceived progress in racial justice has been met with immediate forceful white lash, like I mentioned before. After Reconstruction, there was Jim Crow. After the Civil Rights Movement, there was Nixon's Southern Strategy. After the so-called post-racial Obama years, we got Trump. And now, after 2020, after all those performative corporate pledges, the pendulum is swinging again. It always does. As a Black man in America, I've seen and experienced firsthand how these systems work, not just institutionally, but interpersonally. It was about challenging the culture of exclusion, of coded language, of racially neutral laws, of having to constantly prove yourself in ways that my white colleagues never had to. So when someone says, you're just a DEI hire, what they're really saying is, you don't belong here. You didn't earn this. And let's be clear, Black professionals in these spaces, myself included, are almost always the most qualified people in the room. We had to be. We don't get the luxury of mediocrity. But as we know, this isn't about merit. It's about making sure that whiteness remains the default for success and that Black people who break through are always seen as an exception, a mistake, a diversity statistic. DEI was never perfect. It was always flawed, always limited, often reduced to corporate window dressing, but even that was too much. Even the idea that diversity should be a goal, that equity should be a standard, was intolerable to the people who always benefited from the system as it is. And now, with a political climate that makes anti-DEI rhetoric mainstream, they don't have to pretend anymore. So where do we go from here? That's the question. Because the truth is, we've never been able to rely on institutions to protect us. DEI policies won't save us. Representation alone won't save us either. But understanding the patterns, I believe, recognizing the ways in which that history repeats and echoes itself, that gives us clarity. It reminds us that this fight isn't new. And it damn sure isn't over.
Now that is a wrap on our second episode. We appreciate y'all for listening, for joining, all the comments, all the love, the support, the encouragement. Remember, this is a bi-weekly podcast, so we'll be back here March 1st, same time, same place. And until then, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and keep the conversations going.